The morning sun had barely risen when Sarah Johnson woke up at 5:30 a.m. She knew this was going to be a challenging day. As she got ready for work, she carefully chose her outfit, a navy blue business suit she had bought specially for courthouse appearances. Her hands trembled slightly as she fixed her collar in the mirror. Being a key witness in a major corruption case wasn't easy, but Sarah was determined to do what was right. The drive to Jefferson County Courthouse usually took 30 minutes, but today the traffic was worse than usual. Sarah watched anxiously as the minutes ticked by on her car's dashboard clock. A major accident had blocked 2 lanes on the highway, forcing everyone to merge into a single lane. She gripped her steering wheel tightly, knowing she had an important meeting with federal investigators at 8:30 a.m., followed by her traffic violation hearing at 9 a.m. By the time Sarah found parking in the crowded courthouse lot, it was already 8:25 a.m. She grabbed her files and purse, quickly locking her car before rushing toward the imposing building. The courthouse was a tall structure made of gray stone with large pillars at its entrance. Usually, Sarah would take a moment to admire its architecture, but not today. As she pushed through the heavy glass doors, Sarah joined the long security line. The morning rush meant at least 20 people were waiting to go through the metal detectors. She checked her watch repeatedly, watching precious minutes slip away. When it was finally her turn, she placed her belongings in the plastic bin and walked through the detector. It beeped loudly. "Ma'am, please remove any metal items," the security guard said. Sarah quickly took off her belt and walked through again. This time, she passed through without any beeping, but valuable minutes had been lost. Gathering her things, Sarah hurried to the elevator. A small crowd had gathered there, and someone mentioned it wasn't working. Her heart sank when she saw the out-of-order sign. The federal investigators were waiting for her on the 4th floor, and her traffic hearing was on the 6th floor. She would have to take the stairs. Sarah began climbing the stairs, her high heels clicking against the marble steps. By the 2nd floor, she was already breathing heavily. The heavy files she carried seemed to get heavier with each step. Other people in the stairwell passed her, some giving sympathetic looks as she struggled up the stairs in her professional attire. Reaching the 4th floor at 8:45 a.m., Sarah found the secure conference room where 3 federal investigators were waiting, their faces showing mild annoyance at her tardiness. They quickly got to work. The meeting was crucial. They needed to review her testimony about the corruption she had witnessed in the city's construction contracts over the past year. As the meeting progressed, Sarah kept glancing at the clock on the wall. Her traffic violation hearing was approaching, but she couldn't rush this meeting. The information she had about corrupt officials taking bribes was too important. She had spent months gathering evidence, recording conversations, and documenting illegal deals. This case could change the city's future. At 9:15 a.m., the investigators finally finished their questions. Sarah gathered her things quickly, knowing she was already late for her hearing. Her legs were tired from the earlier climb, but she had to hurry up 2 more flights of stairs to reach the courtroom. The hallway on the 6th floor was quiet, with only the sound of distant voices behind heavy wooden doors. Sarah paused for a moment outside courtroom 6B, trying to catch her breath and fix her hair. She knew Judge Matthews, who would be presiding over her case, was strict about punctuality. Stories about his harsh treatment of latecomers were well known throughout the courthouse. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed open the heavy courtroom door. All eyes turned to look at her as she entered. The room was filled with mostly white faces, and she could feel their stares as she walked down the center aisle. Judge Matthews sat at his bench, his face already showing signs of disapproval at her late arrival. Sarah straightened her shoulders and walked forward, knowing she was about to face his judgment, but unable to reveal the real reason for her tardiness. The courtroom fell silent as Sarah Johnson stood before Judge William Matthews. The large room was cold, and Sarah could feel goosebumps forming on her arms. The judge sat high above everyone else, looking down from his wooden bench with stern, gray eyes. His black robe made him look even more intimidating than usual. Judge Matthews was well known in Jefferson County. At 65 years old, with white hair and thick glasses, he had been serving on the bench for over 20 years. People often talked about how strict he was, especially about time. He believed that being late showed disrespect for the court, and he never accepted excuses from anyone. Looking at his calendar, Judge Matthews spoke in a loud, clear voice that echoed through the quiet courtroom. "Miss Johnson, your hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. It is now." He paused to look at his watch. 9:22 a.m. "Do you have any idea how many people's time you have wasted?" Sarah tried to speak. "Your Honor, I can explain." Silence. Judge Matthews' voice boomed across the courtroom. Several people in the audience jumped in their seats. "In my 20 years on this bench, I have never understood why some people think their time is more valuable than the court's time." The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, sat nearby typing everything into her computer. She had seen Judge Matthews be strict before, but something about his tone today seemed different. She glanced sympathetically at Sarah, who stood alone at the podium, her hands clasped tightly together. The judge picked up Sarah's file and read it out loud. "You're here for running a red light on March 15th at the intersection of Park Avenue and Main Street. The officer's report states that you were clearly in violation. How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied softly. "But if I could explain about this morning." Judge Matthews raised his hand to stop her again. "Miss Johnson, your tardiness today shows a pattern of disregard for rules. First, you ignore a traffic signal, and now you show up late to court." His voice grew harder with each word. Several other lawyers in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one dared to speak up. Sarah stood straight, trying to maintain her composure. She was used to handling difficult situations from her undercover work. This was different. She couldn't reveal that she had been meeting with federal investigators just 2 floors below. Her secret role in the corruption case had to remain hidden, even if it meant taking this unfair treatment. The judge continued his lecture. "This courtroom represents the justice system of our great nation. When people like you show up late, you're not just disrespecting me or this court, you're disrespecting the entire system of law and order." A few people in the back of the courtroom whispered to each other. They had seen Judge Matthews be strict before, but this seemed excessive for a simple traffic violation. Bailiff Officer Rodriguez, who had worked with the judge for years, noticed that the judge's face was getting redder by the minute. Furthermore, Judge Matthews continued, shuffling through some papers on his desk. "I see from your record that you had another traffic ticket 3 years ago. While that case was dismissed, it shows a troubling pattern of behavior." Sarah's heart beat faster. She knew about her clean driving record, and that old ticket had been a mistake. The officer had confused her car with another similar vehicle. But before she could explain, the judge had already made up his mind. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Judge Matthews leaned forward in his chair. His next words came out sharp and clear. "Miss Johnson, for your traffic violation, you will pay the standard fine of $150. However, due to your blatant disrespect for this court's time and your apparent lack of regard for our legal system, I am adding an additional fine of $500 for contempt of court." The audience in the courtroom murmured in surprise. Even the prosecutor, who had been quietly organizing his papers for the next case, looked up with raised eyebrows. The fine seemed unusually harsh, especially for someone who was only 22 minutes late. Sarah stood there, her throat tight with emotion. She was a law-abiding citizen doing important work for justice, yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her, but she knew she had to keep quiet about her real role. Little did Judge Matthews know that his harsh judgment was about to backfire in a way that would change both their lives forever. Sarah Johnson felt her legs grow weak as she stood at the podium facing Judge Matthews' harsh words. The $650 fine would take a big chunk out of her monthly salary. Even though she was doing important undercover work, her official job as a city office clerk didn't pay much. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage to speak. "Your Honor," please, Sahar said quietly, her voice trembling slightly, "I understand being late is disrespectful, but there were circumstances this morning that I cannot fully explain right now." She chose her words carefully, knowing she couldn't reveal her secret role in the corruption investigation. Judge Matthews leaned forward, his thick glasses reflecting the bright courtroom lights. "Cannot explain or will not explain, Miss Johnson?" His tone was sharp, like a teacher scolding a student. "This court doesn't deal in secrets and mysteries. If you have something to say, say it now." The tension in the courtroom grew thicker. Mrs. Peterson, an elderly court reporter who had worked there for 30 years, stopped typing for a moment. In all her years, she had never seen such an intense exchange over a simple traffic violation. She watched as Sarah gripped the podium tightly, her knuckles turning white. "Sir." Sarah tried again. "The elevator was broken this morning, and I had to climb 6 flights of stairs, but there's more to it that I..." Judge Matthews cut her off with a wave of his hand. "The elevator?" He let out a short, harsh laugh that echoed through the courtroom. "Miss Johnson, do you really expect this court to believe that's the best excuse you can come up with? The elevator has been working fine all week." Officer Martinez, the bailiff standing near the judge's bench, shifted uncomfortably. He knew the elevator had indeed broken down that morning. He had put up the out-of-order sign himself. But before he could speak up, the judge continued his lecture. "Let me tell you something about responsibility, Miss Johnson," Judge Matthews said, his voice growing louder. "Every day, hundreds of people manage to arrive at this courthouse on time. They plan ahead, they show respect for our judicial system. Yet you waltz in here 22 minutes late and expect us to believe some story about a broken elevator?" Sarah felt her face growing hot. She wasn't just any ordinary citizen making excuses. She had spent the past year risking her safety to gather evidence against corrupt city officials. Just this morning, she had been reviewing crucial testimony that could put several powerful people in jail, but she had to stand here and take this humiliation in silence. The other people waiting for their cases watched with a mix of sympathy and discomfort. A young lawyer in the background whispered to his colleague, "This seems excessive, even for Judge Matthews." His whisper wasn't quiet enough, and the judge's head snapped up. "Is there something you'd like to share with the court?" Judge Matthews called out to the young lawyer, who quickly shook his head and looked down at his shoes. The judge turned his attention back to Sarah. "Now, Miss Johnson, would you like to try again with a more believable explanation?" Sarah straightened her shoulders, summoning all her strength. Her voice came out clear this time. "Your Honor, I take full responsibility for being late. However, I want to note that I did arrive at the courthouse before my scheduled time. There were security delays and the elevator situation that made me late to this courtroom." The judge's face turned a deeper shade of red. "So now you're blaming our courthouse security? First the elevator, now our security staff?" He shuffled through some papers on his desk angrily. "This is exactly the kind of disrespect I'm talking about. Not only are you late, but you refuse to take proper responsibility for your actions." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't cry here, not in front of everyone. She thought about the important work she was doing, the evidence she had gathered, the corrupt officials she was helping to bring down. The irony of being accused of disrespecting the justice system while secretly working to protect it was almost too much to bear. Just as Judge Matthews opened his mouth to deliver another stern lecture, the heavy courtroom doors burst open. The loud creaking sound made everyone turn their heads. Sarah's heart skipped a beat when she saw who was walking in. Things were about to change dramatically. James Richardson, the head prosecutor of Jefferson County, burst through the courtroom doors like a man on an urgent mission. His normally neat tie was slightly crooked, and his face was red from running up the stairs. At 55 years old, with salt and pepper hair and a strong build, he was a respected figure in the courthouse. Every head in the courtroom turned to watch as Richardson quickly walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor, breaking the tense silence. Judge Matthews looked annoyed at this interruption and was about to say something when he noticed the serious expression on Richardson's face. "Your Honor," Richardson called out, slightly out of breath, "I need to approach the bench immediately. This is an urgent matter of county security." His voice carried authority that even Judge Matthews couldn't ignore. The judge frowned but nodded. Approach the bench, Mr. Richardson. He pressed a button on his desk that turned on the white noise machine, ensuring that no one in the courtroom could hear their conversation. Sarah stood quietly at the podium, her heart beating fast. She watched as Richardson leaned close to Judge Matthews and began whispering urgently. Though she couldn't hear what they were saying, she could see the judge's face changing color, from red to white, then to a shade of pale gray. Richardson spoke quickly and quietly, sometimes gesturing towards Sarah. Your Honor, that woman you're about to find is our key witness in the Bennett construction corruption case. She's been working undercover for the past year, gathering evidence about millions of dollars in stolen city funds. Judge Matthews' eyes widened behind his thick glasses. The Bennett construction case was the biggest corruption scandal in the county's history. The company had been stealing millions of dollars from city projects, but nobody could prove it, until now. This morning, Richardson continued whispering, she was in a classified meeting with federal investigators 2 floors below your courtroom. That's why she was late. We've been keeping her identity secret to protect her safety. There are some powerful people who would do anything to stop her from testifying next week. The judge's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his bench. He looked at Sarah again, seeing her in a completely different light. This wasn't just some irresponsible citizen who couldn't be bothered to arrive on time. This was someone risking her life to fight corruption in their city. The other people in the courtroom watched with curiosity. They couldn't hear what was being said, but they could see Judge Matthews' face growing more shocked by the second. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, had never seen the judge look so uncomfortable in his 20 years on the bench. After what seemed like forever, Richardson stepped back from the bench. Judge Matthews turned off the white noise machine, and the sudden silence made everyone sit up straighter. The judge took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly with a white handkerchief, seeming to need a moment to collect his thoughts. Sarah stood perfectly still, knowing that her secret was finally being revealed to the judge. She thought about all the late nights spent copying documents, the secret recordings she had made, and the dangerous meetings she had attended while wearing a wire. For a year, she had lived a double life, pretending to be a simple clerk while gathering evidence against some of the most corrupt people in the city. Judge Matthews cleared his throat and put his glasses back on. When he spoke, his voice was completely different from before, softer, almost apologetic. Miss Johnson, he said, looking directly at her, would you please approach the bench? Sarah walked forward slowly, her legs feeling slightly shaky. The other people in the courtroom watched with confusion. They had never seen Judge Matthews change his tone so dramatically with anyone. As Sarah reached the bench, Judge Matthews leaned forward and spoke in a low voice that only she and Richardson could hear. Miss Johnson, I owe you an apology. I had no idea of your service to our justice system. Please understand if I had known. Richardson stood protectively next to Sarah, his presence a reminder of the importance of her work. The courtroom remained silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. The same judge who had been ready to punish her minutes ago was now looking at her with something that looked very much like respect and shame. As Judge Matthews sat in his chambers during the court's lunch break, James Richardson spread out several folders on the large wooden desk. Each folder contained evidence that Sarah Johnson had collected over the past year. The judge's hands shook slightly as he opened the first file. Your Honor, Richardson began, what I'm about to show you will explain exactly why Ms. Johnson's work has been so crucial. He pulled out a series of photographs showing secret meetings between city officials and construction company executives. Sarah took these pictures while pretending to work late at her clerk's desk. The judge picked up one photo after another, his face growing more serious with each image. There were pictures of cash being handed over in parking lots, copies of fake invoices, and documents showing millions of dollars missing from city projects. Sarah had risked her safety to capture each piece of evidence. Last winter, Richardson continued, we noticed that Bennett Construction was charging the city $500,000 for materials that should have cost only $100,000, but we couldn't prove anything. That's when Sarah volunteered to help. He pulled out another folder. She took a job as a clerk in their office, earning just $30,000 a year to help us expose this corruption. Judge Matthews leaned back in his chair, remembering how harshly he had treated her just an hour ago. The thought made him feel sick to his stomach. "Tell me more about her work," he said quietly. Richardson nodded and opened another file. Sarah spent months earning their trust. She would stay late, volunteering to file papers and clean up the office. The criminals thought she was just a hard-working clerk. They never suspected she was carefully documenting everything. The story unfolded like a movie. Sarah wore a hidden microphone to record conversations about bribes. She copied important documents during her lunch breaks when everyone else was out. Sometimes she worked until midnight, pretending to catch up on filing while actually gathering evidence. There was constant danger, Richardson explained. These people wouldn't hesitate to hurt someone who threatened their scheme. Sarah knew this, but she kept going. She said somebody had to stand up for what was right. The judge listened as Richardson described how Sarah had discovered the true extent of the corruption. Bennett Construction hadn't just been overcharging for materials. They had been building schools, hospitals, and bridges with cheaper, unsafe materials while charging for high-quality ones. They were not only stealing money but putting people's lives at risk. Last month, Richardson said, pulling out a final document, Sarah found proof that they used weak concrete in the new Children's Hospital Foundation. If she hadn't discovered this, hundreds of sick children could have been in danger. He paused, letting the information sink in. The construction company is already tearing down and rebuilding that foundation at their own expense because of what she uncovered. Judge Matthews stood up and walked to his office window, looking out at the city skyline. He could see several buildings that Bennett Construction had worked on. How many of them were unsafe? How many lives had Sarah helped save? She comes from a family of civil servants, Richardson added. Her father was a police officer for 30 years. Her mother still works as a high school teacher. Sarah said she learned from them that serving the community is more important than personal comfort or safety. The judge turned back to his desk, picking up a paper that showed Sarah's clerk's salary, $30,000 a year, no benefits. And she had been doing the work of an undercover investigator. Meanwhile, he had just fined her $650 for being late to court because of a meeting about this very case. Next week, Richardson said, closing the last folder, Sarah will testify in federal court. Her evidence will help us arrest 12 people, including 3 city officials and the entire top management of Bennett Construction. We expect to recover over $10 million in stolen funds. Judge Matthews sat down heavily in his chair. In his 20 years on the bench, he had seen many cases of corruption, but never someone as brave as Sarah Johnson. She had risked everything to protect her community, while he had jumped to conclusions about her character based on a single late arrival. One more thing, Your Honor, Richardson said, standing up to leave. Sarah has never asked for any recognition or reward. She said she just wants to make sure justice is served. He gathered the folders and walked to the door, leaving Judge Matthews alone with his thoughts and the weight of his earlier mistake. When court resumed at 2 p.m. that afternoon, the atmosphere in courtroom 6B was completely different. Judge William Matthews had asked his clerk to call Sarah Johnson's case first. The courtroom was fuller than before. Word had spread through the courthouse that something unusual was happening. Sarah sat quietly in the front row with James Richardson beside her. She wore the same navy blue suit from the morning, but now she sat straighter, no longer bearing the weight of her secret. Several curious lawyers had slipped into the back rows, wondering why the head prosecutor was personally attending a traffic court session. All rise, the bailiff called out as Judge Matthews entered the courtroom. Everyone stood, watching as the judge took his seat. Those who knew him well could see something different in his demeanor. His usual stern expression was replaced with one of deep thought and humility. "Please be seated," Judge Matthews said, his voice softer than usual. He took off his glasses and looked directly at Sarah. "Ms. Johnson, would you please step forward?" Sarah walked to the podium where she had stood earlier that morning. This time, James Richardson walked with her, standing protectively at her side. The judge cleared his throat, adjusted his microphone, and did something he had rarely done in his 20 years on the bench. He prepared to admit he was wrong. Ms. Johnson, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, I owe you a public apology. A murmur of surprise rippled through the audience. Judge Matthews was known for many things, but apologizing wasn't one of them. This morning, he continued, I made judgments about your character based on a single late arrival. I spoke harshly and unfairly. I did not give you the chance to explain your circumstances, and worse, I allowed my own biases to affect my behavior from the bench. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the old clock ticking on the wall. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above her keyboard as she listened. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that your late arrival was due to your service to this very justice system. The judge's voice grew stronger. While I cannot discuss the details of your work for security reasons, I want this court to know that you represent the highest ideals of civic duty and courage. Sarah stood quietly, her eyes slightly wet with tears. For the first time in a year, she didn't have to hide who she was or what she was doing. The weight of her secret role was finally lifting from her shoulders. The fine I imposed this morning is immediately cancelled, Judge Matthews declared. Furthermore, I am entering into the record a formal commendation for your service to this court and this community. He paused, looking around the courtroom. Let this be a lesson to all of us, myself included, about the danger of quick judgments and unconscious bias. Several people in the courtroom nodded in agreement. The young lawyer who had whispered about the judge's harshness earlier now sat forward, listening intently. Ms. Johnson, the judge continued, his voice becoming more personal, I have been a judge for 20 years. In that time, I have tried to serve justice to the best of my ability, but today you taught me an important lesson about true service and sacrifice. He leaned forward slightly. Would you accept my sincere apology? Sarah stepped closer to the bench. Yes, Your Honor, she said clearly. I accept your apology. Her voice was strong and dignified, matching the importance of the moment. Judge Matthews nodded gratefully. Then he did something unprecedented. He stood up from his bench and extended his hand to Sarah. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Judges rarely left their bench during sessions, but Judge Matthews wanted to demonstrate his respect in a way that everyone could see. Sarah walked up and shook his hand firmly. The bailiff, the clerk, and everyone in the courtroom watched as the elderly white judge and the young black woman shared this moment of understanding and respect. Court is adjourned for 15 minutes, Judge Matthews announced, his voice slightly rough with emotion. As people began to stand and talk quietly among themselves, many eyes remained on Sarah. They didn't know the details of what she had done, but they could sense that they had just witnessed something important, a moment of justice being served in an unexpected way. A week after the courtroom incident, Judge William Matthews sat in the large conference room of the Jefferson County Judicial Center. Around him sat 30 other judges from various courts across the county. They had gathered for what the judge had called an emergency meeting about judicial conduct and bias. The room was quiet as Judge Matthews stood at the podium, the morning sun streaming through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished table. The other judges watched curiously. It was unusual for one of their most senior members to call such a sudden meeting. My colleagues, Judge Matthews began, his voice carrying the weight of experience and newfound wisdom, I want to share with you a story about a mistake I made last week, a mistake that opened my eyes to something we all need to address. He took a deep breath and told them about Sarah Johnson and his harsh treatment of her. As he spoke, the other judges listened intently, some shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, perhaps recognizing similar moments from their own courtrooms. Judge Sarah Martinez, one of the younger judges, took detailed notes. I have been on the bench for 20 years, Judge Matthews continued, and I thought I knew everything about delivering justice. But in just one morning, a brave young woman taught me how wrong I was. He picked up a folder from the podium. This is why I've drafted a proposal for new training programs in our courts. He handed out copies of his proposal to everyone. The document outlined several new initiatives: mandatory training on unconscious bias for all court staff, a new policy requiring judges to hear full explanations before making decisions, and regular reviews of judicial conduct. We must do better, he said firmly. Our job is not just to follow the law, but to ensure every person who enters our courtrooms feels heard and respected. He paused, looking around the room. How many times have we made quick judgments without knowing the full story? Judge Patricia Wilson, who had served for 15 years, raised her hand. Bill, she said, using his first name, I think we've all had moments like this. Just last month, I almost dismissed a case because the plaintiff was late. It turned out he had stopped to help at a car accident on his way to court. Other judges began sharing similar stories, the room filling with voices of experienced judges admitting their own mistakes and biases. It was a rare moment of openness and vulnerability among people who usually had to project constant authority. Judge Matthews then played a recording of his interaction with Sarah from that morning, with her permission. The harsh tone of his voice made several judges wince. Listen to how I spoke to her, he said quietly. Listen to how quickly I jumped to conclusions. In the back of the room, Judge Robert Chin spoke up. What strikes me most is how she maintained her dignity despite your treatment. She could have revealed her role immediately to avoid the fine, but she put her important work first. Exactly, Judge Matthews agreed. And that's another lesson for us. Sometimes the people we are quickest to judge are the ones doing the most important work in our community. He clicked to the next slide of his presentation, showing statistics about bias in the justice system. The numbers were eye-opening. Studies showed how people of color often received harsher treatment in courts, from higher fines to stricter sentences. Judge Matthews had never paid much attention to these statistics before, but now they seemed to leap off the screen. I propose we create a new position, he announced, a court fairness officer who will review our decisions and help identify patterns of bias. The suggestion caused a stir in the room. This was a big change for their traditional system. As the meeting continued, more ideas emerged. Judge Martinez suggested creating a system where people could safely explain their circumstances without fear of additional penalties. Judge Wilson proposed regular community meetings to better understand the people they served. Change won't be easy, Judge Matthews concluded, but it's necessary. My experience with Ms. Johnson showed me that even after 20 years on the bench, we can still learn and grow. He looked around at his colleagues, many of whom were nodding in agreement. The meeting ran over its scheduled time as the judges continued discussing changes they could make. For the first time in years, these powerful people were talking openly about their own biases and mistakes. Sarah Johnson's story had sparked something important, a willingness to learn and change, even among those who thought they already knew everything about justice. 6 months had passed since that memorable day in Judge Matthews' courtroom. The morning sun lit up the front page of the Jefferson County Times, where the headline read, "Major Victory, Corruption Case Ends with Multiple Convictions." Below the headline was a photograph of Sarah Johnson leaving the federal courthouse, head held high. The trial had been a huge success thanks to Sarah's testimony and the evidence she had gathered. 12 people were found guilty of corruption. The former CEO of Bennett Construction was sentenced to 15 years in prison, 2 city officials were given 10-year sentences, and others received shorter prison terms. The city recovered $10 million in stolen funds. Sarah sat in her new office at the district attorney's building, looking at the newspaper. After the case ended, James Richardson had offered her a permanent position as a special investigator. Her salary was now 3 times what she had earned as an undercover clerk. On her desk stood a framed certificate, a special commendation from the FBI for her brave work. A knock on her door made her look up. To her surprise, Judge William Matthews stood there, looking different from the stern judge she had first met. He seemed softer somehow, more approachable, and he carried a small gift bag. "Ms. Johnson," he said warmly, "may I come in?" Sarah smiled and gestured to a chair. "Of course, Your Honor. And please call me Sarah." The judge sat down and placed the gift bag on her desk. "I brought you something to celebrate your success with the case." He watched as Sarah opened the bag and pulled out a beautiful wooden gavel, similar to the one he used in court. The inscription read, "To Sarah Johnson, who taught us all about true justice." "Thank you," Sarah said softly, touched by the gesture. But you didn't have to do this. I wanted to, Judge Matthews replied. And I wanted to tell you about the changes your case has inspired. He pulled out a folder and opened it. In the past 6 months, we've made real progress in our courts. He showed her the statistics. The new training programs had reached over 200 court employees. Complaints about unfair treatment had dropped by 40%. The new court fairness officer had already helped identify and correct several patterns of bias in different courtrooms. But the biggest change, the judge said, looking directly at Sarah, has been in how we listen to people. Every judge now gives defendants more time to explain their situations. We've stopped rushing to judgment. He paused. You taught us that justice requires patience and understanding. Sarah nodded, remembering that tense morning 6 months ago. I've heard about the changes, Your Honor. The community has noticed too. People say they feel more respected in court now. Judge Matthews smiled. That's not all, he continued. Remember that young lawyer who whispered about my harsh treatment that day? He's now leading our community outreach program. Every month, judges meet with local residents to better understand their challenges. Looking out her office window, Sarah could see the courthouse where it all began. The building looked the same, but what happened inside had changed significantly. Even the broken elevator that had caused her to be late that day had been fixed and upgraded. There's one more thing, Judge Matthews said, pulling out a letter. The state's Supreme Court has asked me to lead a commission on judicial reform. They want to implement our new programs across the entire state. His eyes twinkled. And I was hoping you might help us with the training sessions. Your story has power, Sarah. It changes people's perspectives. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. All she had wanted was to stop corruption in her city. She never expected to help change the entire justice system. I would be honored, she said. As Judge Matthews stood to leave, he stopped at the door. You know, Sarah, that morning in my courtroom, I thought I was teaching you about respect for the law. Instead, you taught me about courage, dedication, and real justice. He smiled warmly. Sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected teachers. After the judge left, Sarah picked up the wooden gavel and read the inscription again. The morning sun caught its polished surface, making it shine. In its reflection, she could see how far they had all come, from a tense confrontation in traffic court to a complete transformation of their justice system. Outside her window, people walked up and down the courthouse steps. Each person had their own story, their own reasons for being there. Thanks to the changes inspired by that one morning, more of those stories would now be heard, understood, and treated with the respect they deserved.